Olivia came downstairs before he did. She sat at the dining table and waited. Madame O appeared with tea, looked at her once with those kind, unreadable eyes, and left without a word. Olivia appreciated that. She wasn't ready for words yet. She was still living inside the decision she had made in the dark last night. Turning it over, checking every angle, finding it solid every time. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. He came in the way he always did, jacket on, composed, already carrying the day. He stopped when he saw her sitting there waiting, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, quickly managed. "You're early," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He looked at her carefully across the table. She looked back at him. "I'm done," she said. The stillness in him deepened. "Done," he repeated. "Fighting this." She held his gaze. "Fighting you. Fighting what I feel." She paused. "I'm done with all of it." The dining room was very quiet. "Olivia, I'm not finished." Her voice was steady. "You took my choices away. You put me in a situation I didn't ask for, and I am still angry about that. That part is true, and it doesn't disappear." She looked at him directly. "But this other part is also true, and I'm not going to keep pretending it isn't." He was watching her with that focused, unguarded attention, hands flat on the table, completely still. "What is the other part?" he said quietly. "You know what it is." "I want to hear you say it." She looked at him across the table. This still, complicated, impossible man with his dark eyes, and his secret and his running out time. "I love you," she said. Simply, like a fact she was done arguing with. The silence that followed was the loudest she had ever sat in. She watched it move through him. Not the controlled, almost expression she had catalogued over the weeks, but something completely unguarded, something slow and enormous, like light breaking through water. His jaw tightened. His eyes didn't leave hers. He stood up. He came around the table and crouched in front of her so they were level, eye to eye, and took both her hands in his. "I have wanted to hear you say that," he said. His voice was very low. "Since the first night you were in this house." "You could have just asked me to dinner," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Would you have said yes?" "Absolutely not." He laughed, real, brief, genuine, and she felt it move through her chest like warm water. She brought one hand up and pressed it against his jaw. The healed line of the old cut, the sharp angle of bone beneath, and he turned his face into her palm and closed his eyes for just a moment. "Whatever time we have," she said softly, "I want to spend it like this. All of it. Every day." He understood what she meant. She saw the recognition move through his face, and beneath it the enormous quiet relief of a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time. He kissed her. Not soft, not tentative, nothing asking permission about it. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete decision. One hand gripping her jaw and tilting her face exactly where he wanted it. She felt the possession in it, and didn't pull back. She leaned in and held the front of his jacket in both fists and kissed him back with everything she had been holding in for weeks. And he made a low sound against her mouth that she felt in her spine and pulled her up out of the chair and against him until there was no space left between them. She had never felt so decided about. When he finally pulled back, his breathing was uneven and his eyes were darker than usual, and he looked at her with an expression that was not soft. It was hungry and certain and entirely him. "Mine," he said quietly. Not a question. She should have said something sharp about that. "Yours," she said. Something fierce and warm moved across his face. He pressed his forehead against hers and they stood like that in the morning light, breathing the same air. He was different with her after that. Not softer. She had not expected softer, and would not have wanted it. Kang Tae-jun did not do soft, but he was more present. More openly himself. The careful layers he maintained during the day began thinning around her, and what she found underneath them was not what she had expected. He started coming to find her during the day for no stated reason. He would appear in the library where she was reading and sit across from her, and open his own work, and simply occupy the room with her. Sometimes an hour passed without either of them speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence she had ever shared with anyone. But when he did speak, he was direct in a way that still occasionally stopped her mid-breath. One afternoon she was standing at the library window watching the garden when she felt him before she heard him. She always felt him first now, and his hands came to her waist and pulled her back against him, not gently, and his mouth dropped to the side of her neck. 4 hours of meetings, he said against her skin. How were they? Long. His hands tightened on her waist. I kept thinking about you. She turned in his arms and looked up at him. You kept thinking about me during business meetings? I keep thinking about you always, he said, like it was completely unremarkable, like constant thoughts of her were simply a condition he had accepted and moved on from. It's extremely inconvenient, she laughed. He watched her laugh with something close to reverence. Don't look at me like that, she said. Like what? Like I'm the only thing in the room. He looked at her steadily. You are the only thing in the room. She started to look away. He put a finger under her chin and brought her face back. Don't do that, he said. Low. Do what? Look away when I say something true. She met his eyes. He held her gaze with that absolute certainty, and she felt it move through her. This sensation of being seen completely, no editing, no softening, all of her held in his attention like she had weight and permanence and consequence. He backed her slowly against the bookcase, his hands moving from her waist up her sides, and kissed her. Deep, unhurried, thorough. The kind of kiss that had a destination and knew exactly how to get there. She gripped his lapels and kissed him back, and felt the full heat of him against her, and stopped thinking about anything at all. When he finally pulled back, she was breathless, and the bookcase was the only reason she was standing upright. He looked at her, flushed, gripping his jacket, completely undone. And his expression was the combination she had come to know as entirely his, composed surface, everything on fire underneath. Dinner, he said calmly. 1 hour. He straightened his jacket and walked out of the library. She stood against the bookcase for a full 30 seconds before her legs worked properly. Dinner that night lasted 2 hours, and neither of them wanted it to end. The careful distance that had always threaded through their conversations was completely gone, and what remained was just them, easy and honest and fully present with each other. They talked about everything. He told her about growing up in Seoul, the weight of inheriting a world he hadn't chosen, learning early that men who showed weakness were the first to be consumed by it. She told him about her mother, proud and exacting and never entirely satisfied, and the version of herself she had spent her 20s trying to outrun. Is she quieter now? He asked. That voice. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. Since I came here, actually. Why here? Because you look at me like I'm enough, she said simply. Nobody has ever done that before. The table was quiet. He reached across and took her hand. He held it the way he held everything, completely, with full intention. She turned her hand over in his and held it back. After dinner, he took her hand as they left the dining room and kept it, and she walked beside him through the house that had slowly and entirely become hers, and felt the specific completeness of this. Imperfect, complicated, utterly real. That night he came to her room. He knocked. She opened the door, and he stood in the hallway and looked at her without speaking, and she understood he was giving her the choice. Fully, deliberately, no ambiguity. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He crossed to her slowly, his eyes on hers the entire way, and when he reached her, he didn't kiss her immediately. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, and looked at her face like he was deciding where to start. His hand came up and traced along her jaw, down her neck, slow and deliberate, watching her the whole time, and she felt her breath change. "Tell me what you want," he said, very quiet. "You already know," she said. "I want to hear you say it." She held his gaze. "I want you," she said. "All of you." Something shifted in his eyes. He gripped the back of her neck and kissed her, and she felt everything. The possession, the wanting, the controlled force of a man who had decided exactly what he was going to do and intended to do it completely. She pulled him closer, and he walked her backward toward the bed, without breaking the kiss, and when the backs of her knees hit the edge, he pulled back and looked at her for one long second. "Mine," he said. "Yours," she said back. Without hesitation. He was not gentle. She had not wanted gentle. He was present, completely, overwhelmingly present. His full attention on her, in a way that made her feel simultaneously exposed and entirely safe, like being caught in something and choosing not to escape it. He said her name once in the dark in a voice that had nothing managed about it, and she felt it from her sternum to the base of her spine. Afterward, she lay against his chest in the dark with his arm around her and his hand moving slowly through her hair, and she listened to his heartbeat gradually slow. "Taejun," she said quietly. Don't hide things from me anymore." His hand paused in her hair, then continued. "No," he said. "I won't." She pressed her hand flat against his chest and closed her eyes. She believed him. He was possessive in ways she was still discovering and had entirely stopped resisting. When his men were in the house, he was always between her and the room. Not dramatically, just there, at her left shoulder, one hand at the small of her back, a placement that communicated something to every man present without a single word being spent on it. One evening, an associate who visited regularly, a man who had always let his gaze sit on her a beat too long, said something low in Korean as she crossed the room. She caught part of it. She kept walking. She heard Taejun's voice behind her. Very quiet. She didn't hear the words. She heard the tone. The tone of a man explaining something once, simply, with the absolute certainty that it would not need to be explained again. The associate left early. Taejun appeared in the library 20 minutes later, completely composed, hands loose at his sides. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "That what is mine is not for looking at," he said simply. She put her book down. She crossed the room and kissed him, and he responded immediately, both hands gripping her waist, pulling her fully against him with that decisive force she loved, walking her backward until the bookcase stopped them. "You can't keep doing that," she said against his mouth. His mouth moved to her jaw. "Doing what?" "Claiming me like that in front of people." He lifted his head and looked at her. His hands were still gripping her waist. His eyes were very dark. "Would you like me to stop?" he said. She held his gaze. "No," she said. Something flared in his expression. He kissed her again, and she stopped thinking about the conversation entirely. He had a way of looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. In the garden, at dinner, in the library when she was absorbed in a book. She would look up and find him watching her with an expression his face rarely allowed, something wondering in it, something almost disbelieving, like a man who keeps expecting the thing he loves to disappear and keeps being surprised when it doesn't. One afternoon she caught him and held his gaze instead of looking away. He didn't look away either. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're doing the looking thing." "I look at you," he said simply. "I'm going to keep looking at you." She held her book up in front of her face. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She smiled behind the pages where he couldn't see. She put the book down 2 minutes later and found him still watching her. She threw a cushion at him. He caught it without looking, which was irritating, and set it aside and went back to his work like nothing had happened. She loved him so much, it was almost funny. One night she was already in bed reading when he came in late from a meeting. Jacket gone, tie gone, shirt slightly open at the collar. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the air in the room changed immediately. He crossed to her and took the book from her hands and set it aside, and kissed her before she could say a word, his hand sliding into her hair, and she felt the full weight of his wanting and pulled him down to her. "You're late," she said against his mouth. "I know," he said. He didn't sound sorry about it. "Long meeting?" "Very." His mouth moved to her throat. "Stop talking." "Make me," she said. He pulled back and looked at her, the challenge in her eyes, the smile she was suppressing, and something in his expression went very still and very focused, and then he did exactly what she'd asked. She didn't say another word for a long time. Later she lay tucked against his side in the dark, one hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her palm. Working steadily. Working hard. She pressed her hand a little flatter against his chest. "I can hear you thinking," he said. "I'm not thinking," she said. "I'm listening." "To what?" "Your heart," she said simply. He was quiet. His hand came up and covered hers against his chest, pressing her palm more firmly into him. They lay in the dark, and she listened to his heart and thought about the folder, about the math, about 11 to 14 months, and she made herself stay here, in this room, in this warmth, in this moment, and not let the future steal a single second of the present. She found the files 3 weeks later. It was late evening. Taejun was in a long meeting down the hall. She had gone to his study for a book he had mentioned, something on the lower shelf behind his desk. She found the book. When she straightened, she knocked a thin folder off the desk edge. It landed open on the floor. She picked it up. She told herself she wasn't going to look at it while she was already looking at it. Photographs, documents, printed communications. Her Korean was good enough now. Good enough to read slowly, to understand the architecture of what she was holding. Photographs of the restaurant, of her, of Park Jin-woo, an order, in Taejun's name, dated 3 days before that night. She stood in the middle of the study and read it twice. Then she set it carefully on the desk and stood completely still and let it move through her like cold water, all the way down. He had ordered it. He had ordered the man killed. And then he had taken that death and used it to build a trap around her. The witness, the planted evidence, the frame, all of it deliberate. All of it by the same hands that held her face when he kissed her. The same hands that had pressed over hers against his chest in the dark last night. She picked the folder up. She walked down the hall. She opened the conference room door. 7 men looked up. Taejun looked up last, and the moment he saw her face, saw the folder, something moved in his eyes. He said one quiet word in Korean, and every man in the room stood and filed out, and then it was just the 2 of them. She put the folder on the table between them. "Tell me," she said. He looked at the folder, then at her. He didn't reach for it. "Tell me," she said again. Quiet. Controlled. "I was having him followed," Taejun said. "His organization had connections to people I had problems with. I had been watching him for weeks." A pause. "And then, one night, I watched him put his hands on you." She said nothing. "In the back corridor," he said. "He cornered you. You kept your composure. You walked away." His jaw tightened. "He laughed after you left." The room was completely still. "So you had him killed," she said. "Yes." "And then you framed me for it." "Yes." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She placed both hands flat on the table. "Why the frame?" she said. "Explain that part." He held her gaze. He was not going to look away. She knew that about him. "I saw you that first night," he said. "Before the surveillance. Before I knew anything about his organization, I saw you and I—" He stopped, started again. "I had never wanted to know a person the way I wanted to know you. Immediately, from across a room. A pause. And I knew you would never come to me willingly, not knowing what I am. So, you made sure I had nowhere else to go? She said. Yes. He didn't deny it. She watched him choose not to defend himself. Yes, he said quietly. You're right. She sat with that honesty and felt it complicate everything the way honesty always did. I should hate you for this, she said. Yes, he said. You should. The fear. Running alone in the dark, trying to escape something I knew nothing about. She looked at him steadily. You did that to me. I know. Say the whole thing, she said. Out loud. He held her eyes. I had Park Jinwoo killed, he said, because he put his hands on you, and laughed about it, and I couldn't let that stand. A pause. And because I wanted you. And I made the world dangerous enough that I became your safest option. I framed you. I manufactured the evidence. I took your choices away. He didn't look away. All of it was me. Silence. She sat with it for a long time. She felt two things simultaneously with equal force. The anger, real, legitimate. The full weight of what it meant to have her life dismantled by someone else's decision. She felt it completely. She didn't push it away. And she felt the other thing. The thing that had been building for months in greenhouses and shooting ranges and midnight kitchens and dark rooms. She felt that just as fully. He had freed her from a man who had made every single shift feel like a threat. He had watched her be diminished, and he had ended it. Wrongly, unforgivably, but from a place she couldn't locate pure coldness in. And in the wreckage of what he had done, he had also, somehow, given her the first place she had ever felt completely and entirely herself. Love was not supposed to be this complicated. She pushed back from the table and stood up. He stood immediately. Olivia. Give me a minute, she said. She walked to the window. She looked at the dark garden, the greenhouse lit softly from within, the orchids white behind the glass. She breathed. She thought about it all. About Hyunwoo's pale face. About running in the dark. She thought about his hand covering hers in the dark last night, pressing her palm against his chest, against his working, running out heart. She turned around. He was standing exactly where she had left him. No move toward her, giving her everything she had asked for. His face completely open, no composure over the top of it, just him, waiting for whatever she decided. I'm angry, she said. I'm going to be angry about this for a long time. I know. You don't get to make decisions about my life. Not anymore. Not ever again. Understood, he said. No hesitation. And you don't deserve what I feel for you, she said. I want you to know that I know that. Something moved through his face. I know it too, he said softly. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and looked up at his face. This hard, impossible man who had committed something unforgivable, and somehow, in the middle of it, had also seen her more clearly than anyone ever had. But I love you anyway, she said. So there it is. He looked at her for one long moment. Then his hand came up and gripped her face. Not gently, not asking. And he kissed her with a certainty that had nothing tentative about it. She gripped the front of his shirt in both fists and kissed him back, and felt the anger and the love existing together in her chest, both real, both entirely hers. When he pulled back, his forehead dropped against hers. Every day, he said quietly, whatever you'll give me. Every day, she said. That night she lay beside him in the dark with her hand pressed flat against his chest the way she always did. She felt his heartbeat beneath her palm. Still working too hard. Still pushing. She listened to it for a long time. Taejun, she said quietly. I found your medical folder, she said. 3 weeks ago. In the study. I read it. She kept her voice steady. Your heart. He was quiet for a moment. I wondered, he said. When you said, Whatever time we have. I understood. Why did you decline the treatment? She said. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. I had nothing to live for, he said simply. No one to live for. A pause. At the time, that was true. She lay with that for a moment, with the weight of it, with the specific sadness of a man who had looked at his own life and found it empty enough that fighting for it hadn't seemed worth the effort. She pressed her hand a little firmer against his chest. And now? She said softly. He looked at her in the dark. Now I have everything, he said. She lay there with his heart beating under her palm and felt everything move through her at once. The grief and the love and the tenderness and the specific ache of understanding someone completely, of seeing all of them, the broken and the beautiful parts together, and choosing them anyway. And that was enough. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday morning. She sat on the edge of the bathtub with the test in her hand and let the information settle. Her first feeling was not fear. Fear was there, but it wasn't first. First was something warm and slow and certain that moved through her. She went to find him. He was in his study on the phone at the window. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway and read her face in 1 second flat and ended the call. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, she said. She held the test out. He took it. He looked at it. She watched the information land, watched his face move through something she had never seen there before, something that came from much further down than his usual expressions, something completely unmanaged. He looked up at her. His eyes were very bright. Olivia, he said. His voice had nothing steady about it. I know, she said. He crossed to her in 2 steps, and his hands came up to hold her face, and he just looked at her. His thumbs against her cheekbones, his eyes moving over her face like he was memorizing it. How do you feel? He said. Terrified, she said. Happy. Both at exactly the same time. Both, he said. He kissed her forehead, her cheek, then her mouth. Slower than usual, more careful. The possession still there, but something else layered underneath it now. Something that made her eyes sting. She pulled back. Don't start being gentle now, I mean it. Something moved in his face. You just told me you're carrying my child. And I'm still me, she said. Don't treat me like I'm breakable. He looked at her for 1 moment. Then he pulled her into him, tight, decisive, completely, and pressed his mouth against her hair. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever known, he said. Yes, she agreed. His arms tightened around her. She felt him exhale, slow, long, deep, against the top of her head. She pressed her face against his chest and closed her eyes and felt his heart beating under her cheek, working hard, the way it always did, the way it would for as long as it could. She held on to him and thought, every day, every single one. That evening they sat together in the garden until the cold drove them inside, talking about names, about what this child might be like, about the future they were building from the wreckage of how they had begun, like the clock ticking didn't matter. He talked about the baby with quiet intensity, that focused deliberateness he brought to everything he intended to protect. She watched him and loved him with a completeness that had no reservation left in it. Later, when he was asleep, she pressed her hand flat against her stomach and made a silent promise to both of them. She would remember every day. She would not let a single hour go to waste. She didn't know the hours were already being counted by someone else. She went to the garden the next morning as she always did. The orchids were in full bloom behind the greenhouse glass, white and pale purple, perfectly still in the spring light. The paths were cold and damp beneath her feet. She walked slowly with her hands in her jacket pockets and her face tipped up to the pale soul sky. She was thinking about names. She was thinking about the way Taejun had pressed his hand flat against her stomach last night before he slept. Careful and certain, the way he held everything he intended to keep. She was thinking about the way he had looked at her across the dinner table earlier that evening, that unguarded focusing of attention, like she was the only fixed point in a room full of moving things. She was 8 weeks pregnant and irrevocably in love with a man who had stolen her freedom and given her everything else, and the morning was cold and beautiful and entirely hers. She was completely unprepared. The sound came first, wrong, too close, the particular wrongness of a sound that doesn't belong in a safe place. She turned. Then hands. Multiple. Fast. Professional. One arm around her waist, one hand over her mouth before the sound building in her throat could become anything useful. She drove her elbow back hard, connected, heard a grunt, drove it back again. She clawed at the arm around her waist, twisted, got one hand free and reached for the face behind her, the way Tae-jun had taught her. In the shooting range. Going for the eyes. Going for anything sensitive. It wasn't enough. There were 3 of them. Maybe 4. Too many and too prepared. And within 40 seconds she was in the back of a vehicle she hadn't seen, and the garden was gone. She pressed her bound hands against the seat behind her and breathed. The baby. She turned her attention inward immediately, listening, checking. No sharp pain. No cramping. The struggle had been brief, and her abdomen had been protected. They hadn't hit her there, which told her they knew she was pregnant, which told her they had been watching long enough to know everything. She exhaled. She looked at the vehicle around her. Tinted windows. 2 men in the front, one beside her. Professional silence. Nobody performing, nobody trying to intimidate her with words. This was not amateur work. This was organized and deliberate, and that told her something important. They wanted Tae-jun to come for her. They wanted him to come specifically, which meant they had a plan for when he did. She looked at the man beside her. "He will come for me," she said, in Korean, slow and clear. The man didn't look at her. "And when he does," she said, "you should be very afraid of that." The cold room was exactly what she had expected. Concrete, one light, metal chair, wrists bound behind her, ankles free. The same calculation as before. They weren't afraid she would run because there was nowhere to run to. She sat in the chair and she breathed, and she thought about Tae-jun walking into the empty garden and finding only the stone paths and the orchids, and no Olivia. She thought about what that would do to his face. She thought about his heart. That thought moved through her chest like something sharp, and she pressed it down and replaced it with something more useful. He would come. She knew that with the absolute certainty of someone who had spent months learning a person completely. Would come and he would be careful, and she needed to be ready to move the moment the door opened. A man came in eventually. Broad. Expressionless. He delivered his message in Korean. "Stay quiet. Cooperate. You won't be harmed." And she let him finish, and then she said, "Tell whoever sent you that Kang Tae-jun does not negotiate. He does not cooperate. He does not send messages back." She held the man's eyes. "He comes. And then it's over." The man left. She sat in the cold room and held herself together and waited. Tae-jun was in a meeting when Jinho appeared in the doorway. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Tae-jun read his face in 1 second. The particular controlled urgency of a man delivering the worst possible news to someone who cannot afford to react the way the news deserves. And he was on his feet before Jinho opened his mouth. When Jinho said her name, the room went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Tae-jun felt his heart, that overworked, compromised, running out heart, do something in his chest that he had no clinical category for. Not the familiar pressure of its usual protests. Something that went past physical entirely. Something that lived in the part of him that had her name on it, that had her face on it, that had the sound of her laugh and the specific warmth of her hand pressed against his chest in the dark. They had found that part. They had reached in and taken what was there. He was moving before the feeling finished arriving. His men assembled in 4 minutes, 14 of them, the best he had. He stood at the head of the table and looked at Jinho's location intel, and felt his body do what it always did in these moments. Set everything aside. File everything away. Reduce the entire situation to a single line from where he was to where she was. He felt his heart in his chest, pushing too hard already, and he filed that away too. Not now. Not yet. All of them, he said quietly. Every single person in that building. Nobody asked him to clarify. He moved through the building with his men around him and felt nothing except direction. The building was 4 floors and she was on the second, and he moved through it with the controlled efficiency of a man who had been doing this for 20 years and had never had a reason this absolute. The first floor took 6 minutes. The stairwell took 30 seconds. The second floor corridor was longer than expected, and he moved through it with Jinho at his left shoulder and felt his heart in his chest the whole time. Too loud, working too hard, pushing against the walls of what it could sustain. And he filed it away one more time. After. Deal with it after. The door at the far end of the corridor was different from the others. He recognized the difference immediately. He took the lock off and pushed it open. The room was cold and bare, and she was in the chair in the center of it, with her wrists bound behind her and her chin up, and her eyes on the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. The unguarded second. The one she knew how to read. The one that showed everything. He felt it move through his face, and he didn't try to stop it. Relief so total it moved through him like a physical force, like something that had been held under enormous pressure for the last 40 minutes, suddenly given room to be what it was. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, and his hands went to the restraints immediately. "I'm okay," she said. "Tae-jun, look at me. I'm okay." He looked up. He ran his eyes over her face, her neck, her arms, looking for what they had done. "The baby is fine," she said. "We're both fine. I checked." He closed his eyes for 1 second. His hands stilled on the restraints and he felt them trembling. Barely, almost imperceptibly, the body asserting what the mind had been overriding for the last 40 minutes. "I've got you," she said softly. "Tae-jun, I've got you." He opened his eyes and finished freeing her wrists, and then his arms were around her, and she was against his chest, and he pressed his face into her hair and breathed her in. The specific, irreplaceable reality of her, alive and warm and here, and felt her arms come around him and hold on with everything she had. She held him tighter. "I told them you would come," she said. "You were right," he said. "I told them they should be afraid." He pulled back and looked at her face and felt something move through his expression that he didn't manage, fierce and warm and proud all at once. "You were right about that too," he said. They made it through the building and out into the cold night air. The courtyard was controlled, his men moving through the space with the quiet efficiency of aftermath. She breathed the cold air in deeply, and she was already feeling his pulse against her fingers the way she always did now, that habit she had developed without deciding to. She felt it change. Not dramatically. Not the sudden wrongness of a crisis. Something incremental. A stumble in the rhythm, the particular flutter of a heart that had been pushed past what it could sustain. She stopped walking. "Tae-jun, I'm fine," he said. "You're not." She turned to face him and looked at his face in the cold courtyard light, the pallor beneath his composure, the tightness around his eyes. "Don't manage this, not with me." Something in him settled. That recognition of her. That specific yielding that only happened with her. "I just need a minute," he said quietly. "Jinho," she said, without looking away from Tae-jun's face, "get the car. Now." Jinho was already moving. Tae-jun's legs didn't go this time. She didn't let them. She had her arm around him and his around her, and she kept them both upright through pure stubbornness. one hand pressed flat against his chest, feeling his heart stumbling and lurching and pushing, still fighting, and she pressed her hand harder against him and thought, "Not tonight. Not here. Not like this." "Keep walking," she said, low and fierce and directly into his ear. "Walk with me. Right now." He walked. The car reached them before they reached the car. Jinho had brought it across the courtyard, and the door was open, and she got Taejun inside, and got in beside him, and took his hand, and held it against her own chest so he could feel her heartbeat. Steady. Present. Here. And looked at him in the dim interior light. His color was wrong. His breathing was shallow. But his eyes were on her. Clear. Fully present. "We're going home," she said. "And then you are going to let someone help you." He looked at her for a long moment. "Olivia." "That was not a question," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't think it was." She held his hand against her chest the entire way home and felt her own heart beating under his palm and thought, "Hold on. Just hold on. We're almost there." They made it home. The mansion had never felt so much like home as it did that night. Madame O was at the door before the car stopped. Jinho must have called ahead because the house was lit and warm and there were people moving with quiet purpose inside. Olivia got out first. She went around to his side and opened the door, and he looked at her from the seat with that particular expression she had come to know, the one where he was deciding whether to accept help or manage without it. She held his gaze and said nothing. She just waited. And after a moment he took her hand and got out. He was steadier than he had been in the courtyard. She noted that. His color was still wrong, but his legs were holding, and his grip on her hand was firm, present, intentional. Madame O looked at him, then at Olivia. Her face said everything her voice didn't. "His room," Olivia said, "and call Dr. Shin, tonight." "Already done," Madame O said quietly. They went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed beside him while Jinho helped him out of his jacket, and she watched his face the way she watched it in the dark every night. Reading it, cataloging it, looking for what was real beneath what was managed. He was tired in a way that went past the night's events. She could see it now clearly, in the particular heaviness around his eyes, in the slight slackening of the control he usually wore so completely. He looked at her looking at him. "Stop," he said. "Stop what?" she said. "Doing that thing where you assess me." "I'm not assessing you," she said. "I'm looking at you." "You're counting things," he said. "I can tell." She reached over and took his hand and held it in both of hers. She turned it over and pressed her fingers against his pulse point the way she had started doing in recent weeks. That quiet, private monitoring that he had never called out until now. His pulse was uneven, slower than it should have been after exertion, which was worse in its own way than fast. "How long has it been like this?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "A few weeks," he said. "It comes and goes." "You didn't tell me." "You were—" "Don't," she said. "Don't say I was pregnant and you didn't want to worry me. Don't say that." He looked at her. The composure was entirely down. He was just Taejun, tired and honest and completely hers. "I didn't want to worry you," he said. She pressed her lips together. She looked at their hands, then back at his face. "I have been listening to your heart every single night," she said quietly. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" He said nothing. "I notice everything," she said. "You know that about me." He turned his hand over in hers and held it back. "I know," he said softly. "I know you do." Dr. Shin arrived at 11. He was a small, precise man in his 60s, with the specific, unhurried manner of someone who had delivered serious news enough times to have made peace with the weight of it. He examined Taejun thoroughly and without commentary. Olivia sat in the chair by the window and watched, and kept her face still, and her hands loose in her lap, and did not say a single word until he was done. When Dr. Shin finally sat back and looked at Taejun across the bed, she stood up and moved to stand beside Taejun, and she took his hand. Dr. Shin looked at them both. "The episode tonight was a significant cardiac event," he said carefully. "Not the first, I suspect." He looked at Taejun. "You have been having smaller episodes for some time." "Yes," Taejun said. "How long have you been having the dizziness?" 3 weeks, Taejun said. "Intermittent." Dr. Shin nodded slowly. He folded his hands. "Mr. Kong, we have discussed the treatment options before and you have declined. I need to ask you again tonight. Not as a formality." He paused. "The window for intervention is not unlimited. If we are going to pursue transplantation—" "He's pursuing it," Olivia said. Both men looked at her. She looked at Taejun. "You're pursuing it," she said. Not loudly, not with anger. With the complete, quiet certainty of a woman who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it. "We have a baby coming. You told me you were done hiding things. You told me no more secrets." She held his gaze. "This is not your life to spend alone anymore. It is ours. And I am telling you that you are going to let them help you." Taejun looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. She held his hand and held his gaze, and she waited. Something moved across his face. Not resistance. She had braced for resistance, and it didn't come. What came instead was something that looked, after a moment, like the specific relief of a man who had been holding a very heavy thing alone for a very long time and had just been told he was allowed to put it down. "All right," he said quietly. She held his gaze. "All right? All right," he said again. And something in the way he said it the second time, with more weight, more decision, told her he meant it. Not just for tonight, for everything that came after. She exhaled slowly. She turned back to Dr. Shin. "What do we do first?" The hospital began the search for a donor heart the following week. Dr. Shin was careful with his language. "We are initiating the process. The timeline is uncertain. We will monitor closely in the interim." But beneath the careful language, the fact was simple. Taejun was on a list. His body was being managed. His heart was being watched by people whose job it was to watch it. He was no longer carrying it alone. Olivia went with him to every appointment. She sat beside him in the consultation rooms and listened to everything and asked the questions she needed answered and held his hand in the waiting rooms without making it a production. Just held it, naturally, the way she had started doing everything with him. He let her. That was the thing that moved her most. Not the appointments, not the treatment plan, not the careful medical language. The fact that he let her. That Kang Tae-jun, who had spent his entire adult life being the person who held everything together for everyone else, who had built an empire on the bedrock of never showing weakness, who had declined treatment rather than surrender to the indignity of needing help. Let her hold his hand in a waiting room without pulling away. She didn't make a thing of it. She just held on. He moved her into his room on a Tuesday, not dramatically. There was no announcement, no formal moment. She came upstairs after dinner to find that her things had been moved. Her books were on the shelf beside his. Her clothes were in the wardrobe next to his suits. Her small collection of Chicago photographs, the ones she had brought from home and never quite found a permanent place for, were on the dresser beside the lamp. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room that had always been his, and was now theirs, and felt something settle in her chest that had no name adequate enough for it. Taejun appeared behind her. "You moved my things," she said. "You're my wife," he said simply. "This is your room." She turned and looked at him. "You could have asked," she said. "I could have," he agreed. He held her gaze. "Do you want me to move them back?" She looked at him for a moment. At the absolute composure of him, the certainty, that unblinking possession that she had stopped fighting and started finding comfort in a long time ago. "No," she said. Something moved in his eyes. He reached out and pulled her against him. Not gently, just the way he always did, completely and without apology, and pressed his mouth against her hair. "Good," he said quietly. She pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heart. Uneven still. Working hard still, but present. Still here. Still holding. Keep going, she thought. Just keep going. The weeks that followed were the fullest of her life. She had thought that knowing about his heart, really knowing, openly, with no pretending on either side, would make the days feel shadowed, would make every good moment feel borrowed. She had braced for that. She had prepared herself for the specific grief of happiness that knows its own expiration date. It wasn't like that. It was the opposite of that, because they were both awake now, fully, completely awake to every day in a way that people who believe they have unlimited time never quite managed to be. They didn't waste mornings. They didn't let dinners pass in distraction. They didn't save things for later. They were present with each other in a way that was almost unbearably real. She would find him in the kitchen making tea in the early morning, and he would look up when she came in, and his face would do that thing, that unguarded focusing of attention, as if she was the most interesting thing that had ever walked into a room. And she would feel it move through her like warmth, and she would think, "This is what we built from the wreckage. This." He was different with her now, too. Still possessive. That hadn't changed, and she hadn't wanted it to. But there was something new underneath all of it, a tenderness he no longer managed or controlled or put away. It expressed itself in small things. The way he adjusted her jacket collar when they were going out, carefully, without being asked. The way he woke before her every morning and lay still so she could sleep longer because she needed the rest, and he had decided she was getting it. The way he had started reading aloud to her at night. Not romance, not anything soft. Whatever he was reading himself, technical or philosophical or occasionally something that made no sense to her at all. Just his voice in the dark, steady and present, giving her something to fall asleep to. She told him once that she liked it. He didn't acknowledge the compliment. He just kept reading. The next night he did it again. She loved him in a way that had long since passed the point of being something she chose and had become simply something she was. Like being from Chicago. Like being herself. Irrevocable. She pressed her hand against her stomach, round now, unmistakably present, and thought about the person growing inside her who had his eyes, she was certain, and her stubbornness. She was equally certain, and who was going to come into a world where their father had decided to fight. Good, she thought. Fight. The call came on a Wednesday night. Olivia was in the library when she heard the change in the house, that particular shift in atmosphere she had learned to recognize over months of living inside Taejun's world. She put her book down. Taejun appeared in the library doorway 2 minutes later. Already in his jacket. Already somewhere else in his eyes. That operational focus she knew. The one that meant the part of him that ran things had taken over from the part of him that sat in this library with her and read aloud in the dark. She looked at him. "One of the warehouses," he said, "south of the river. They've hit it." "Who?" "A faction we've been watching." He came into the room and crouched in front of her chair the way he sometimes did, getting level with her, making sure she was fully in his attention before he said something important. His hands rested on the arms of the chair on either side of her. "I need to go." She looked at his face, at the composure and the focus, and underneath both of those things, the awareness. She could see it in him, had been able to see it for weeks now, of his own body. The slight deliberateness with which he had been moving lately. The way he sometimes paused at the top of the stairs for just a second before continuing down. Small things. Things nobody else would notice. She noticed everything. "How long?" she said. "A few hours." "Take Jinho," she said. "And don't." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She had promised herself she would not become someone who asked him to be smaller than he was, who asked him to stay behind walls when his world required him to move. That was not the life they had chosen, and she would not diminish it with fear now. She started again. "Come back," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, warm and fierce and grateful all at once. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth, slow and certain, one hand coming up to hold her face the way he always did. "Always," he said against her mouth. Then he straightened and was gone. She sat in the library and pressed her hand flat against her stomach and listened to the house change around his absence and told herself he was going to be fine. He had promised. And Kang Tae-jun kept his promises. He came back at 2 in the morning. She was asleep, or half asleep, that particular shallow hovering that had replaced deep sleep in recent weeks, her body too round and too aware of itself to fully let go. She heard the front door. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. She heard the bedroom door open and the careful quiet of a man trying not to wake her. She turned over. He was standing at the foot of the bed taking his jacket off, his back to her. She looked at the line of his shoulders, the set of them, the way he rolled his neck once before hanging the jacket over the chair. A gesture she recognized as the private decompression of a man letting the operational mode go now that he was home. He turned and saw her awake. "I told you not to wait up," he said. "I wasn't waiting up," she said. "I was sleeping." "You were watching me." "I was half asleep and you walked into my field of vision," she said. "How did it go?" He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He looked at her in the low light. "It's handled," he said. She reached up and pressed her hand against his face. He turned into it immediately. That small, involuntary surrender she had come to love. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." She looked at him carefully. He looked tired. More than the night's events accounted for. But his eyes were clear, and his color was better than it had been in the courtyard, and his pulse under her fingers at his jaw was, she counted, uneven but present. "Come to bed," she said. He lay down beside her and she tucked herself against his side and pressed her hand flat against his chest and listened to his heart the way she always did. She closed her eyes. "I'm glad you're back," she said quietly. His arm tightened around her. "I know," he said. "Go to sleep." She did. The headaches started 10 days later. The first one happened at breakfast. She saw it. A brief contraction across his face, quickly managed, the slight closing of his eyes for less than a second before he opened them, and continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. She said nothing. She filed it away. The second one happened in the library 2 days after that. She was reading and he was working, and she looked up and found him sitting very still with his hand pressed against the side of his head, his eyes closed, his breathing deliberate. He didn't know she was watching. She watched for a full 30 seconds before he lowered his hand, opened his eyes, and went back to his work. She went back to her book. That night she called Dr. Shin. She did it from the garden, quietly, while Tae-jun was in a meeting. She described what she had seen, the frequency, the duration, the way he managed them, the dizziness she had noticed twice when he stood up too quickly. Dr. Shin listened without interrupting. "This is consistent with what we've been monitoring," he said carefully. "The reduced cardiac output affects cerebral perfusion. Headaches and dizziness are expected symptoms as the condition progresses." A pause. "How is he otherwise?" "Functioning," she said. "You know how he is?" "Yes," Dr. Shin said. "I do." Another pause. "Mrs. Kang, the search for a donor is ongoing. These symptoms are serious, but they are manageable for now. Keep him rested. Keep him calm. And call me immediately if the headaches worsen, or if there is any loss of consciousness." She stood in the garden with the phone in her hand after the call ended and looked at the orchids through the greenhouse glass, white and pale purple, perfectly still, and breathed. Manageable for now. She held on to those 3 words. She didn't tell him she had called Dr. Shin. She didn't need to. 3 days later, he came, to find her in the bedroom where she was folding laundry. A task Madame O would have handled without being asked, but that Olivia had quietly taken back because doing small useful things made her feel less helpless. And he stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment and then said, "I spoke to Dr. Shin today." She kept folding. "Did you?" "He mentioned you had called him?" "He wasn't supposed to mention that." "He thought I should know." Tae-jun came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at her steadily. "You've been watching me." "I always watch you," she said. "More than usual." She put down the shirt she was folding and turned to face him. "You've been having headaches for 10 days, she said. "You haven't said a word about them." He held her gaze. "I didn't want to worry me," she finished. "I know." Tae-jun. She crossed to him and stood in front of him and put both hands on his face, tilting it up slightly, making him look at her fully. "We agreed. No more carrying things alone. Either of us." He looked up at her. In the afternoon light, he looked tired in that deep way she hated seeing. The tiredness that went past the day and came from somewhere more fundamental. "They're manageable," he said. "I know they're manageable," she said. "Dr. Shin told me. But manageable doesn't mean you carry them alone and pretend they're not happening." She held his face in her hands. "Tell me when they happen, that's all I'm asking. Just tell me." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She searched his face. He meant it. She could tell. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a moment. "The donor," she said quietly. "Dr. Shin said the search is ongoing." "Yes. Good." She pulled back and looked at him. "Then we wait. And while we wait, we do not pretend. We do not manage. We are here together, exactly as we are." She held his gaze. "Agreed?" Something moved through his face. "Agreed," he said softly. She kissed him, firm and brief, and entirely decided. And then she went back to the laundry because the laundry needed folding, and life needed to keep moving. And she had decided a long time ago that she was not going to let fear steal the days she had been given. He sat on the bed and watched her fold laundry for 10 minutes without saying anything. She didn't tell him to stop watching. She had stopped telling him to stop watching a long time ago. The days that followed were good days. She would know that later with the specific clarity of hindsight, but she knew it then too. Which was the more important thing? She was 8 months pregnant, and her back ached, and she couldn't sleep for more than 3 hours at a stretch, and she moved through the mansion like a ship in full sail, as Jinho had once described it under his breath, and then looked immediately alarmed that she had heard him. She had laughed for 5 minutes. Tae-jun had looked at Jinho with an expression that was completely straight-faced and said, "She heard you," and then had looked back at his papers with the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth. She loved their life. She loved the specific texture of it. The morning tea and the library and the garden and the late dinners that lasted too long. She loved the way Madame O had started leaving small plates of fruit outside her room at midnight, because she had mentioned once that she got hungry in the night. She loved the way the old man in the greenhouse had started saving the best orchid blooms for her, leaving them at the kitchen door without explanation. She loved the way Tae-jun looked at her across rooms, like she was the only fixed point, like she was the answer to something he had been asking for a very long time. He had been getting the headaches every few days now. He told her when they happened. He had kept that promise, which she had not entirely expected and which moved her every time. He would simply say, quietly, in passing, "I have one today," and she would note it and watch him and not make a production of it, and that was how they had agreed to carry it. Together. Out in the open. No pretending. The dizziness came twice in the 3rd week. Once at the top of the stairs. She was behind him and she saw his hand go to the wall and stay there for 3 seconds before he continued. And once at dinner, a brief moment where he set his chopsticks down and pressed 2 fingers to his temple and breathed. Both times, she looked at him. Both times, he looked back. Neither of them said anything in the moment. They had moved past needing to. That evening after dinner, she sat across from him at the cleared table with her hands wrapped around her tea and looked at him in the warm dining room light, and felt the love she had for him so completely that it had nowhere to go. It simply filled her entirely and stayed there, enormous and quiet and absolute. He looked back at her with those dark, focused eyes. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "You're doing the looking thing." "I look at you," she said, echoing him. "I'm going to keep looking at you." Something moved in his face, something warm and unguarded and entirely real. He reached across the table and took her hand. They sat like that in the quiet dining room while the house moved gently around them. It was 3 days after that dinner that it happened. They had eaten well. Madame O had made something that smelled extraordinary, and Tae-jun had eaten more than usual, which she had noted with quiet satisfaction, because his appetite had been inconsistent, and she had been watching it the way she watched everything. They had talked through the meal, easy and unhurried, about the baby's room which was still half finished, about a name they kept circling without landing on, about something Priya had said in her last call that had made Olivia laugh, and which she had recounted badly, and Tae-jun had listened to with patient amusement. It had been a good dinner. Afterward, he pushed back from the table and pressed 2 fingers briefly to his temple. She saw it. She always saw it. And then he stood up and looked at her. "I need to rest," he said. His voice was even. Normal. "I'm going to lie down." She looked at him, at his face, at the tiredness in it, deep, bone level, the tiredness of a body that had been working too hard for too long and was asking for something. "Okay," she said. "Priya called earlier," she continued. "I'll call her back quickly and come to bed." She stood, reached up and pressed her hand against his jaw the way she always did, and he turned his face into her palm the way he always did, and she held it there for a moment. "Okay, baby." He looked at her for a moment as if committing her face to memory, his hands on her waist. "Don't be late. I love you." "I love you more, my love." He pressed his lips against hers. Then he turned and walked toward the stairs, steady, composed, entirely himself. She watched him go. Then she picked up her phone and called Priya. The call with Priya was good. It was the kind of conversation that reminded her who she had been before Seoul, before the restaurant, before the alley and the black car and Kang Tae-jun, and showed her how far she had traveled from that woman without losing any of the essential parts of her. Priya made her laugh twice. They talked about the baby, and Priya said something that made Olivia press her hand against her stomach and smile at the ceiling. It was a good call. When it ended, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the sitting room and let the warmth of it settle. Then she pushed herself up, 8 months pregnant and the couch was not her friend, and moved toward the stairs. She was still smiling. She took the stairs slowly, one hand on the rail, the other on her stomach. The house was warm and quiet around her. She pushed the bedroom door open and crossed to the vanity, and sat down and reached for her makeup remover. "Priya says the name we picked sounds like a K-drama character," she said, her voice low and comfortable in the quiet room, which I personally think is a compliment considering where we live, but she seemed to think it was a concern. The room was dim. The lamp on his side was off. The curtains were drawn the way he always drew them when he wanted to sleep. She worked the makeup remover across her face in slow circles, still talking. "She also wants to visit after the baby comes." I told her yes, obviously, but I may have forgotten to mention the part where we live in a Mafia compound. She smiled at her own reflection. "I figure that's a detail we can cover when she arrives." She set the cotton pad down and reached for her moisturizer. "She asked if you were treating me well." She glanced toward the bed in the mirror. I told her you were impossible and possessive and that I was disgustingly happy. She smoothed the moisturizer across her face. She said that tracks. She waited for the sound that usually came at this point. The low exhale of amusement, or the single word of dry commentary, or just the shift of movement that told her he was awake and listening even when he pretended not to be. Nothing. She looked at the bed in the mirror. Baby? She said. The shape of him under the covers was still, completely still in the particular way of deep sleep. She had seen it 100 times, knew the rhythm of it, the slight rise and fall. Except there was no rise and fall. She put the moisturizer down. Babe? She kept her voice light, unsuspecting. Still asleep? Nothing. The stillness of the room pressed against her suddenly in a way that was different from before. She stood up from the vanity. She crossed to the bed. She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. Taejun. He didn't move. She turned him toward her, gently and then with more urgency, and pressed her fingers to the side of his neck, the way she had done 1,000 times, feeling for the pulse she had memorized, the particular rhythm of him, the heartbeat she had pressed her ear against in the dark, and counted and held onto and begged silently to keep going. Nothing. The silence where his heartbeat should have been was the loudest thing she had ever experienced. It moved through her like the world ending. No, she said. It came out small, almost a whisper, like the word itself couldn't hold what was behind it. No. She pulled him toward her fully and pressed both hands against his chest and felt the stillness beneath her palms. That complete, devastating stillness. So different from sleep, so different from rest, the stillness of something that has stopped. And something broke open in her chest that had no name and no bottom. No. It tore out of her. Not a word anymore. Something past words. The sound of a woman whose hands were pressed against the chest of the man she loved and feeling nothing. You can't do this to me. She was shaking, both hands flat against his chest, pressing as if pressure alone could restart something. You can't. Taejun. Please. She was weeping. She hadn't decided to. It didn't matter. We still have to raise our baby. Her voice was breaking apart with every word. My love. We still have to raise our baby. You can't. The door burst open. Jinho came through first, which meant someone had heard her. The sound she had made had traveled through the walls of this house and brought them running. And behind him 2 more of Taejun's men, and behind them Madame O, and all of their faces when they understood, held the same thing. Not surprise. Grief. Deep, already present grief. The grief of people who had known this was coming, who had been watching it approach for months, who had prepared themselves as best they could, and were discovering now that preparation meant nothing when the moment actually arrived. Jinho crossed to the bed. He stood on the other side of it and looked at Taejun and his face, that broad, usually impassive face that had given nothing away. In 20 years of service, crumpled for just a moment before he pulled it back. Mrs. Kang, he said, quietly, gently. Don't, she said. Don't. She was still pressing her hands against Taejun's chest, still holding on. Her tears were falling onto the covers, onto his shirt, and she didn't move, couldn't move. The idea of taking her hands away was impossible, was unthinkable, was the thing she was not ready for and would not be ready for. He knew, Jinho said, very quietly. He knew it could happen like this, quickly, in his sleep. A pause. He told me, a few weeks ago, that if it happened this way, it was the way he would have chosen. No pain. At home. Jinho's voice was steady but only barely. With you close. She pressed her forehead down against Taejun's chest. She could hear nothing beneath it now. Just the silence. Just the enormous, absolute silence where his heart used to be. You asked for 365 days, she whispered into his chest. I would have given you a lifetime. Do you know that? Every single day I had. Every one. The room was very quiet around her. Madame O was crying silently in the doorway. The men behind Jinho were looking at the floor. Jinho himself stood on the other side of the bed with his hands at his sides, and his jaw set hard and his eyes very bright. She lay against Taijun's chest in the quiet room and held his hand and pressed it against her stomach. The way he used to do, the way she had watched him do in the dark when he thought she was asleep, that careful, certain gesture, and she felt the baby move beneath it. She closed her eyes. She stayed for a long time. The years passed. Not gently, not cruelly. Just continuously, the way time moves when it has decided not to ask your permission. One day following another with its own quiet momentum, carrying her forward whether she was ready or not. She raised their daughter in Seoul. She had thought about going back to Chicago. She had thought about it seriously in the first hard year, when the mansion was too quiet and the garden felt like a place something essential had been removed from. She had packed a bag once, sat on the edge of the bed, their bed, his and hers, the one she still slept in, with the bag at her feet. Unpacked it 2 hours later. This was her city. She had chosen it twice. The second time was the braver choice. The third time, choosing to stay after he was gone, was the bravest of all. She stayed. She raised their daughter in the house with the greenhouse and the orchids, and the stone paths in the garden, and Madame O, who stayed without being asked, and Jinho, who never left, and the old man who still left orchid blooms at the kitchen door without explanation. She raised her in the specific warmth of a place that had been loved incompletely, that had the memory of love built into its walls, and she told herself every day that this was enough. That giving her daughter a home full of his memory was enough. Most days she believed it. Her daughter was 6 years old when she asked about her father. They were in the garden on a spring afternoon, the orchids in full bloom behind the greenhouse glass, white and pale purple, the same as always, every year, reliable as anything she had ever known. Her daughter had been crouching to examine something on the stone path, with the focused thoroughness she brought to everything. Her father's thoroughness, wearing her face. And she stood up and looked at Olivia with her father's eyes. Dark, direct. That particular focused attention that still occasionally stopped Olivia's breath. "Mama," she said, "what was my father like?" Olivia sat down on the stone bench and gathered her daughter onto her lap and held her and took a slow breath. "Your father," she said carefully, "was a very complicated man. Was he good?" Olivia looked at the greenhouse. "He was dangerous," she said honestly. "His world was dangerous. There were things he did that were wrong." She paused. "But he loved us. More than anything else in his life. More than his own life." She pressed her lips against her daughter's hair. "And he was brave and beautiful and kind. He was careful with the things he loved. And he had a laugh that surprised you every time you heard it because it was so real and so unexpected." She felt her throat tighten the way it still did, sometimes, without warning. "He was someone worth knowing." Her daughter processed this with the serious thoroughness she brought to everything important. "Do you miss him?" she asked. "Every day," Olivia said, simply, without hesitation. "He was the love of my life." Her daughter leaned back against her and looked at the orchids and said nothing else, and Olivia held her in the spring light and felt the specific fullness of this moment, the grief in it and the love in it, and the way the two things had learned, over years, to exist side by side without one swallowing the other. Later, alone, she went to his grave. She had been coming here for years now, on the hard days and the good days and the days that were simply days. It had stopped feeling like visiting a long time ago. It felt like continuing something, a conversation that had never really ended because she had never let it end. She stood in front of the stone and put her hand on it, and felt the cold solidity of it and everything that lived in the space between those two things. "She has your eyes," she said. "She's stubborn too." I have absolutely no idea where she gets that. The garden was quiet around her. Soul hummed in the distance, vast and indifferent and entirely hers. She asked about you today, she said. I told her the true parts, the parts that mattered. She paused. I told her you were someone worth knowing. Her hand pressed a little firmer against the stone. I meant it then. I mean it now. I will mean it every time I say it for the rest of my life. She was quiet for a moment. I still hear it sometimes, she said softly. In the night. I reach across the bed and I still expect to feel. She stopped, breathed. I press my hand against my own chest sometimes, the way I used to press it against yours. She felt her eyes sting. I count my own heartbeat, and I think about how I used to count yours. How I used to lie there and think, hold on, just hold on a little longer. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. You held on so long, my love. You held on so much longer than anyone thought you could. The spring light moved through the trees above her, slow and warm and pale. You asked for 365 days, she said. I need you to know. Every single day after that was yours too. Every one. They all belong to you. She pressed her palm flat against the stone. They still do. She stood there a while longer, her hand on the stone, the city breathing around her. The life she had built from the wreckage of an impossible love continuing to move and grow and insist on itself the way life always did. Loudly, stubbornly, with complete disregard for what it had already cost. She took her hand off the stone. She straightened. She breathed. She turned and walked back toward all of it, toward her daughter in the garden with her father's eyes, toward the orchids, toward the house that still held the memory of him in every room, toward the future that was still happening and still hers, and still, despite everything, worth every complicated, irreplaceable, imperfect day. If you made it here, truly, thank you. If you felt that bedroom scene in your chest, if you held it together until the grave and then didn't, you are not alone. Neither am I. Drop a comment and tell me which moment broke you the most. Hit that like button if this story deserved it. Subscribe, because there are more stories coming, and I promise, none of them will let you go easy. See you in the next one. The end.